If you think authority protects the truth, you haven't seen what happens when it makes a mistake. In the heart of downtown Chicago, on a gray afternoon that felt heavier than usual, Officer Brian Miller stood outside a quiet intersection where a routine call had just taken an unexpected turn. A man in simple civilian clothing had been flagged during a minor security report. Nothing more than a vague description passed through dispatch. No weapons, no threats, no urgency. Yet something about the situation made tension rise in ways no one could fully explain. The man, later identified as Marcus Walker, remained calm as he answered basic questions, his voice steady, his posture composed, his eyes carrying a kind of stillness that didn't match the assumptions being made around him. Brian Miller, shaped by years of protocol and instinct, began to interpret that calm as evasiveness. The situation escalated not through action, but through perception, as misunderstanding built layer by layer. Within minutes, Marcus was being formally placed under temporary detention for verification of identity, a standard procedure that now felt anything but standard. Bystanders gathered at a distance, recording quietly, sensing that something about the moment carried weight beyond its surface. Marcus did not resist, did not raise his voice, did not attempt to argue beyond a simple request for clarity. He only said, with quiet precision, that there had been a mistake and that the matter would resolve itself if the right channels were contacted. But Officer Miller was focused on procedure, not possibility. What no one on that street realized was that Marcus Walker was not simply a civilian passing through the city. Beneath the plain clothing and unassuming presence was a man whose identity carried authority far beyond what was visible. As communication was made to verify records, a subtle shift began in the background systems that governed more than just local law enforcement. Phone calls were made, brief, coded, and directed toward channels that most officers never interacted with. The air around the scene felt heavier, not from action, but from anticipation. Marcus remained still, his expression unchanged, as though he had already seen how this moment would unfold long before anyone else had. And somewhere, far from the streetlights and sirens, a decision was already beginning to form that would determine whether this situation remained a misunderstanding or became something far more consequential. Officer Miller glanced at Marcus's identification again, narrowing his focus as if repetition could confirm certainty, but the details did not shift. Everything appeared ordinary on the surface, yet something about the way the system responded in the background felt increasingly unusual. A second officer arrived, observing quietly, noting the lack of resistance and the controlled demeanor of the individual in question. The crowd remained distant, their phones raised, capturing fragments of a story they did not yet understand. Marcus's attention drifted briefly toward the horizon, where the city moved on without awareness of the ripple forming in its structure. His calm was not surrender, but patience, the kind shaped by environments where waiting often revealed more than reacting. Inside dispatch channels, references began to align with identifiers that did not belong to standard civilian profiles, prompting subtle hesitation in the voices reading them. The word confirmation pending replaced earlier certainty. Officer Miller felt it first as a shift in tone, not yet in action, but an uncertainty creeping into procedure. Marcus finally spoke again, not to defend himself, but to repeat a simple instruction to verify through proper command channels, as if he already knew which outcome was inevitable. The street, once ordinary, now held a silence that felt deliberate, as though the world itself was pausing to decide what kind of truth it was about to reveal. The silence that followed felt heavier than any sound that had come before it, stretching across the street like an invisible pressure that no one could name, but everyone could feel. Officer Brian Miller stood near the edge of the intersection, watching the situation with growing uncertainty as standard procedures continued to unfold in a way that no longer felt standard at all. The initial report that had seemed routine was now surrounded by layers of confirmation requests and delayed responses that did not match typical response timing. Marcus Walker remained where he was, his posture unchanged, hands steady, eyes calm, as though time itself had slowed around him while everyone else was trying to catch up to something they could not yet see. The second officer on scene lowered his voice as he spoke into his radio, repeating identification checks with increasing precision, but each reply seemed to introduce more hesitation than clarity. The name Marcus Walker had returned multiple results across different systems, but certain fields were locked behind authorization levels that were not immediately available to local enforcement. That detail alone shifted the atmosphere slightly, like a door quietly closing in a room no one realized was open. Marcus did not react to the change in tone. Instead, he repeated his earlier request in the same calm voice, asking only that proper verification channels be followed through military liaison contact, as if he were reminding them of a step in a process they had temporarily forgotten. Officer Miller exchanged a brief glance with his partner, that look carrying more questions than answers, as the crowd continued to observe from a distance, phones raised but movements slower now, as if even they sensed that the situation was no longer following familiar patterns. Inside dispatch, a supervisor began cross-checking identifiers manually, pulling records that required deeper clearance, and the results were not immediate. There was mention of a military affiliation, but the classification level prevented full visibility, leaving only fragments of information that suggested authority rather than defining it. The word verification echoed again through the radio channel, now accompanied by a recommendation to pause escalation until confirmation was complete. Marcus remained composed, shifting his gaze briefly toward the skyline, where distant buildings reflected the fading light of the afternoon. His expression carried no urgency, no frustration, only the kind of patience that comes from operating in environments where information always arrives in layers rather than moments. Officer Miller, however, began to feel the discomfort of uncertainty growing within the structure of procedure itself. Every step he had taken so far was correct according to protocol, yet the outcome no longer felt aligned with certainty. A third communication arrived, this time more direct, instructing all units to maintain position and await external authorization review. The phrase external authorization carried weight that neither officer fully understood yet, but it was enough to slow the pace of the moment even further. Marcus finally shifted his stance slightly, not as a reaction, but as a quiet acknowledgement that the system around him was beginning to adjust itself. No one spoke for several seconds, and in that space between instructions and understanding, it became clear that whatever was happening was no longer contained to a single street or a single decision. Something larger was beginning to move just beyond their immediate reach, and it was already in motion before anyone on the ground realized they were part of it. The delay in response had stretched longer than anyone on scene felt comfortable acknowledging, turning seconds into something that felt closer to minutes as the system behind the situation continued to process what could not yet be publicly confirmed. Officer Brian Miller stood with his partner near the edge of the intersection, both of them now less focused on control and more focused on waiting for instructions that seemed to be coming from a level above their normal chain of command. Marcus Walker remained still, his presence unchanged, as if he were observing the situation from a position that extended beyond the immediate street and into something far more structured and deliberate. There was no urgency in his posture, no visible reaction to the increased hesitation in the officers around him, only a quiet patience that made the surrounding uncertainty feel even more pronounced. The radio on Officer Miller's shoulder crackled again, this time with a more formal tone, requesting confirmation of identity clearance through military liaison channels that were not typically engaged during local field operations. The language had shifted subtly from verification to authorization review, signaling that the situation was no longer being treated as routine. A new instruction followed, advising all units to maintain full procedural compliance while awaiting direct confirmation from higher jurisdictional oversight. That phrase alone changed the mood on scene, because it suggested that whatever was unfolding was no longer contained within local authority. Marcus finally adjusted his stance slightly, not in response to pressure, but as though acknowledging that the correct channels were now beginning to align with what he had expected from the beginning. His expression remained steady, but there was a quiet certainty in his stillness that contrasted sharply with the growing uncertainty among the officers. The second officer lowered his voice and asked for clarification from dispatch once more, but the answer that came back was incomplete, referencing restricted classification status that required external military authentication. The word restricted created a pause that lingered longer than expected, as if even the system itself was recalibrating how to interpret the situation. On the street, the crowd remained at a distance, their attention fixed but quieter now, sensing that the energy of the moment had shifted from confrontation to confirmation. A few phones continued recording, capturing the stillness as much as the action, preserving a moment that no one yet understood the meaning of. Inside dispatch, a supervisor escalated the request upward, bypassing intermediate review layers and initiating contact with federal military coordination channels. The process introduced another delay, but it also introduced a new level of seriousness that could no longer be mistaken for uncertainty. Officer Miller looked briefly toward Marcus again, noticing the same calm expression that had not changed since the beginning. And for the first time, he felt the weight of possibility that this situation might not resolve in the way he initially assumed. Marcus spoke only once more during this interval, his voice even and controlled, reminding them that verification would come through proper command structure and that any premature conclusions would only delay clarity. The words were not delivered as a warning, but as an observation, as though he were describing a system he had seen operate many times before. The atmosphere around the intersection continued to shift in subtle layers, each new update from dispatch reducing certainty and increasing awareness that the situation was operating under rules beyond what was visible on the surface. And somewhere far beyond the city block, the process that had already been set in motion continued to move forward, carrying with it a level of authority that had not yet fully revealed itself to anyone standing on the ground. The moment following the last update from dispatch carried a different kind of silence, one that was no longer uncertain but carefully restrained, as if every voice involved in the communication chain had been instructed to proceed with maximum precision and minimum interpretation. Officer Brian Miller remained in position near the intersection, his posture now less about control and more about compliance with instructions that were coming in slower but more deliberate, each one adding a layer of formality that was not present at the beginning of the incident. Marcus Walker stood unchanged, his presence steady in a way that no longer invited speculation from those closest to him, because the system itself was now doing the confirming. The radio transmitted another message, this time with clear reference to military coordination approval in progress, indicating that identification protocols had reached a stage requiring direct command verification rather than local validation. That shift in language created an immediate change in the behavior of the officers on scene, who now operated under the understanding that they were no longer leading the situation but temporarily holding it in place until higher confirmation arrived. Marcus did not speak, but his attention subtly shifted toward the far end of the street, where movement had begun to appear that did not belong to the normal rhythm of the neighborhood. At first it was distant, barely distinguishable from regular traffic, but within moments it became clear that multiple coordinated vehicles were approaching with deliberate timing. The second officer attempted to maintain procedural focus, asking dispatch for estimated arrival confirmation, and the response was immediate but brief, stating that military liaison contact had been established and ground verification units were en route. The phrase ground verification units changed the atmosphere again, replacing uncertainty with anticipation. Officer Miller adjusted his stance slightly, his attention now divided between Marcus and the approaching presence that was beginning to take shape at the edge of visibility. Marcus remained composed, his expression unchanged, as if the arrival had already been accounted for long before it became visible to anyone else. Within moments, the first vehicle entered the block, followed by additional units moving in coordinated spacing, their presence structured and controlled rather than reactive. The vehicles did not rush or accelerate, but instead moved with deliberate pacing that suggested authority rather than urgency. As they came to a stop, the surrounding environment seemed to settle into a different state, one where every action carried formal weight. Doors opened, and personnel stepped out in uniform alignment, their focus immediately directed toward the center of the scene where Marcus Walker stood. Officer Miller felt the shift instantly, not through announcement, but through recognition of protocol he had only encountered indirectly in training scenarios that were rarely relevant to field operations. The lead figure among the arriving personnel approached with measured steps, identifying himself through a brief exchange with dispatch before confirming presence on site. The communication was concise, professional, and definitive, signaling that verification was now transitioning from electronic confirmation to physical validation. Marcus finally turned slightly toward the arriving group, acknowledging their presence with a calm nod that suggested familiarity with the process unfolding around him. The lead officer reviewed the situation briefly, scanning identifiers and cross-referencing them with the updated authorization feed, which now displayed a level of clearance that required immediate procedural adjustment. Officer Miller observed the change in real time, noticing how the tone of communication shifted from inquiry to confirmation without hesitation. The atmosphere on the street had now fully transformed, no longer centered on suspicion or enforcement, but on recognition and alignment with higher command structure. Marcus remained steady at the center of it all, not as a subject of escalation, but as a point around which the system itself was reorganizing its understanding of authority. The arrival of the coordinated units marked a decisive shift in the atmosphere, not through force or disruption, but through the quiet authority of confirmation taking shape in real time. Officer Brian Miller stood slightly back from the center now, his role no longer defined by action, but by observation as the chain of command above him began to fully assert itself onto the situation. The lead military liaison reviewed the digital authorization feed once more, his attention fixed on the updated clearance status that continued to refresh with increasing specificity. Marcus Walker remained at the center of the interaction, his presence steady and unchanged, as though the convergence of systems and personnel around him had always been expected rather than surprising. The communication device held by the arriving unit transmitted a secure verification request, and within moments the response returned with full validation through military command structure. The tone of the environment changed again, subtle but undeniable, as procedural uncertainty was replaced by formal recognition. Officer Miller received a direct instruction to maintain perimeter awareness while command personnel assumed jurisdictional control of the situation, a phrase that effectively repositioned authority away from local enforcement entirely. The second officer lowered his gaze slightly, acknowledging the shift without needing further explanation, as the presence of higher authority removed the ambiguity that had defined the earlier stages of the encounter. Marcus finally spoke in a calm and measured tone, not to assert himself, but to confirm continuity with the process now unfolding around him, stating that he had anticipated the verification would reach this stage once proper channels were engaged. His voice carried no tension, only clarity, as if the outcome had always been a matter of procedural time rather than uncertainty. Within minutes, a second wave of vehicles arrived, this time carrying personnel whose insignia reflected a higher tier of military command oversight. The lead among them stepped forward with composed precision, exchanging brief formal acknowledgement with the existing liaison before turning attention directly toward Marcus. There was no hesitation in his recognition, only confirmation, as he reviewed the final authorization signal displayed on his secure device. The information was complete, unambiguous, and fully aligned with classified military status that required immediate procedural adjustment across all present units. Officer Miller watched as the structure of authority around him reorganized itself without resistance, each level of command aligning to the next in a sequence that left no room for interpretation. Marcus stood calmly as the lead commander approached, offering a brief acknowledgement that reflected both respect and familiarity within a formal chain of military protocol. The commander confirmed identity verification allowed for record purposes, and the statement carried finality that immediately stabilized the entire situation. The earlier uncertainty that had defined the scene no longer existed, replaced entirely by structured recognition and formal jurisdictional transition. Marcus's expression remained composed, his focus steady, as the environment around him fully adapted to the reality that had now been officially established through command confirmation. The officers on site shifted their positioning slightly, not out of confusion, but out of procedural compliance with newly established authority boundaries. The street, once filled with hesitation and fragmented understanding, now reflected a unified recognition of command structure that had fully replaced speculation with confirmation. And in that moment, The situation that had begun as a routine field response had now become an official military-level verification event, fully documented, fully acknowledged, and completely realigned within the highest levels of operational authority. The formal confirmation delivered through the military command structure created a final and irreversible shift in the atmosphere, as every participant on scene now operated under a clearly defined hierarchy that replaced all earlier uncertainty with structured authority. Officer Brian Miller stood at a respectful distance from the center, his posture steady but subdued, acknowledging through silence that jurisdiction had fully transitioned beyond local enforcement. The lead military commander maintained a composed stance while reviewing the final verification output on his secured device, ensuring that every layer of authentication matched the highest level of clearance required for full recognition. Marcus Walker remained at the center of this controlled environment, his presence unchanged, as though the entire sequence of events had unfolded exactly as anticipated from the beginning. There was no urgency in his demeanor, no visible reaction to the structured shift occurring around him, only a calm awareness that reflected long familiarity with processes of this nature. The commander stepped slightly forward, issuing a formal acknowledgement that confirmed Marcus Walker's identity under full military classification, ensuring that the record was now permanently aligned with command-level recognition. That statement marked the end of all procedural ambiguity, and the environment responded instantly, as communication channels adjusted to reflect the confirmed status. Officer Miller received a direct instruction to formally disengage from enforcement authority regarding the individual in question, and the instruction carried immediate effect without room for interpretation. The surrounding officers adjusted their positions accordingly, not out of hesitation, but as a direct response to finalized command protocol. Marcus finally turned his attention fully toward the lead commander, exchanging a brief and composed acknowledgement that reflected mutual understanding within a formal military structure rather than a civilian interaction. The commander responded with measured professionalism, confirming that all necessary notifications had been transmitted to relevant oversight divisions, ensuring that the incident would now be recorded within official military documentation systems. The street itself felt different now, no longer defined by tension or uncertainty, but by the stillness that follows full procedural resolution at the highest operational level. Marcus remained composed, his posture unchanged, as if the entire sequence had been less about escalation and more about delayed recognition of established authority. Officer Miller observed quietly as the final adjustments were made in real time, noting how quickly perception had shifted once verified information replaced assumption. The lead commander concluded the on-site verification by confirming secure transfer of jurisdictional acknowledgement into military records, ensuring that all local systems reflected the updated classification. Marcus gave a final slight nod, acknowledging completion of the process without requiring further explanation or attention. Around them, the coordinated units maintained position briefly before receiving instructions to stand down into standard operational posture. The transformation of the scene was now complete, not through confrontation, but through structured recognition that had redefined every role present on the street. What had begun as a routine response had evolved into a fully verified military-level confirmation event, leaving behind a quiet understanding that authority had not been taken or challenged, but simply revealed through the correct chain of command. The final stage of the operation unfolded with a quiet precision that reflected complete procedural closure, as every active communication channel transitioned from verification status to formal documentation and post-incident reporting. The military commander on site maintained a composed presence while confirming that all identity validation records for Marcus Walker had been fully secured within classified command archives, ensuring that the event was no longer subject to local interpretation or informal review. Officer Brian Miller stood at a respectful distance, no longer participating in any operational capacity, but instead observing the finalization of a process that had moved far beyond the scope of routine enforcement. The surrounding officers gradually shifted into standard disengagement posture, acknowledging through silent compliance that authority had been fully reallocated to military jurisdiction. Marcus Walker remained calm at the center of the scene, his expression unchanged, as though the conclusion of the verification process was simply the expected outcome of a system operating at its correct level. There was no visible reaction of satisfaction or frustration, only a composed stillness that reflected familiarity with structured command resolution. The commander exchanged a final brief confirmation with dispatch headquarters, ensuring that all regional systems had been updated to reflect full clearance status and operational acknowledgement. Within moments, the coordinated units began transitioning out of active posture, not in haste, but in controlled sequence that marked the end of their involvement. Officer Miller received formal instruction confirming that no further action was required from local enforcement, and that all records would be transferred to higher jurisdictional review for archival completion. The weight of the moment now shifted from action to consequence management, as administrative systems began processing the event in full detail for internal evaluation. Marcus Walker gave a final composed acknowledgement to the commander before turning slightly toward the direction of the street where the initial misunderstanding had begun, his posture remaining steady and unchanged. The commander responded with professional respect, confirming that all necessary notifications had been sent through secure channels to ensure complete procedural transparency at all required levels of oversight. As the vehicles prepared to depart, the environment gradually returned to its natural state, though the significance of what had occurred remained embedded in the structure of those who had witnessed it. Officer Miller watched as Marcus began to move away from the center of attention, escorted only by the quiet acknowledgement of those who now fully understood the nature of his verified status. There was no spectacle, no escalation, only the final settling of a situation that had been resolved through proper chain of command rather than conflict. The street returned to normal flow, but the memory of the sequence remained with those present, not as an event of disruption, but as an example of how authority operates when correctly identified through its proper channels. Marcus Walker continued forward with calm purpose, leaving behind an environment that had fully adjusted to the reality of recognition rather than assumption, while the system itself closed the record with complete procedural alignment and formal closure. The formal resolution of the operation did not immediately dissolve the weight of the moment, as the aftermath continued to unfold in subtle administrative and procedural layers that extended beyond the physical presence of military units on the street. Officer Brian Miller remained near the intersection for several additional moments after the main command personnel had begun to withdraw, observing how the environment slowly transitioned back into its normal civilian rhythm, though it no longer felt entirely the same to those who had been part of the sequence. Marcus Walker had already moved forward along the sidewalk, his pace unhurried and steady, no longer surrounded by active personnel, yet still carrying the quiet presence of someone whose identity had just been fully confirmed at the highest operational level. The surrounding city resumed its ordinary motion, vehicles passing through intersections, pedestrians continuing their routines, but the awareness of what had just occurred lingered in the background like an unspoken reference point. Officer Miller adjusted his stance and briefly looked toward his partner, neither of them speaking for several seconds, as both processed the transition from escalation to full command verification and closure. Inside the official reporting channels, the event had already been marked as resolved under military jurisdiction, with complete clearance documentation and authorization logs filed in secure archives that would not be accessible through standard local systems. Marcus Walker continued walking at a steady pace, his expression unchanged, as if the entire sequence had been less about conflict and more about the proper activation of structured verification protocols that had taken time to reach the surface. A few steps behind, the second officer remained in place momentarily before turning away, signaling the end of active field responsibility. The atmosphere in the area had shifted from uncertainty to reflection, not because anything visible remained unresolved, but because the experience itself had altered the understanding of those who had witnessed it firsthand. Marcus turned slightly at a corner, pausing only briefly as he looked down the continuation of the street, before proceeding forward without urgency. There was no additional engagement, no further communication, only the continuation of movement beyond the point where formal recognition had already been fully established. Officer Miller finally lowered his radio, no longer receiving active updates, as the system had transitioned the incident into final status confirmation. The city noise gradually filled the space again, blending ordinary life back into the environment that had briefly paused for structured authority review. Marcus Walker disappeared further down the street, no longer the center of attention, but still defined in record as the confirmed subject of a fully validated military-level identity resolution. Behind him, the scene had already been reduced to documentation, while ahead of him, the world continued as though nothing had interrupted it, except for those who now understood that what they had witnessed was not disruption, but the precise alignment of authority and recognition at the highest level. The final records of the incident had already been sealed within formal military and administrative systems, but the impact of what had occurred continued to echo quietly through. Those who had witnessed it firsthand, especially within the small group of officers who had initially approached the situation as a routine field response. Officer Brian Miller stood at the edge of the now quiet intersection for a final moment before turning away, his movements slower than before, as though the weight of the sequence was still being processed internally rather than operationally. The street had fully returned to normal activity, vehicles passing through intersections and pedestrians moving without awareness of the prior escalation. Yet for those present earlier, the meaning of the moment had permanently shifted. Marcus Walker was no longer visible in the immediate area, having continued forward without interruption once the formal verification process had been completed and recorded. His presence was no longer tied to the scene, but the confirmation of his identity remained fully embedded in the official system, now finalized under complete military authorization. Inside the communication network, the last updates confirmed closure of active engagement, with all field instructions marked as complete and all command-level acknowledgments fully synchronized across relevant departments. Officer Miller finally lowered his radio completely, signaling the end of any remaining procedural involvement, and exchanged a brief glance with his partner, both of them remaining silent as they prepared to leave the area. There was no celebration, no confrontation, only the quiet understanding that the situation had been resolved at a level far beyond initial assumptions. As they walked away, the environment behind them continued its ordinary rhythm, but the memory of the sequence remained sharp in their awareness, not as a moment of conflict, but as a demonstration of how quickly perception can shift when authority is correctly identified through proper channels. Marcus Walker, now fully absent from the physical space, remained present only in record and in the understanding of those who had seen the system adjust itself in real time. The city continued forward without interruption, but for those involved, the experience had become a reference point that would not fade easily, serving as a reminder that not every situation is defined by what is immediately visible, and that some forms of authority only become clear when the correct structure is finally engaged and recognized through the full chain of verification and command alignment.